week and 2 weeks and 3 weeks after that, tell me the mood around here after General Conference 2019. Frustrated? Yeah. Disappointed? Sad? Yeah, absolutely. Yes, there was this sense of grief, of loss, of pain, of a situation we didn't want to be in, and which many of us felt was not necessarily where God was calling us to go. Now, as chair of the Board of Trustees of the annual conference, we are at the service of the whole annual conference. And so I wanted to start out recognizing our shared status in the Reconciling Ministries Network, but to name that there are other congregations having these conversations from a different place. Amen? And we can name and know that. And they are praying their way through their journey as well right now. So on the heels of that, there was an asked for judicial council ruling on the so-called traditionalist plan that was passed. And part of that was referred to as the Graceful Exit Amendment. Have you heard that language before? Graceful Exit Amendment. Okay. So I'll walk you through that. Ultimately, both were deemed mostly constitutional. And when I say constitutional, we do not mean in reference to the Constitution of the United States, but to the Constitution of the United Methodist Church. Does that make sense? Okay. Part of the work that was assigned to boards of trustees around the connection as part of that Graceful Exit Amendment was to work with other fiduciaries within the annual conference to develop a disaffiliation process for congregations that so choose to go through that. Does that make sense? Okay, just want to keep you pulling you along on the journey here, folks. So that task force is comprised of 2 board of trustee members. That's myself and one other member of our executive team. The chair and leadership of the Board of Pensions and Health, which is a very complex space, and I'll speak to that very, very briefly. And then our Council on Finance and Administration, the dean of the cabinet and the bishop, and our assistant to the bishop, Cindy Gregerson. So that's the group that is tasked with developing this disaffiliation process. So I'm going to speak to a couple of things this morning. One is the decision tree. That's really what this graphic is the decision tree for various congregations. And then I want to speak to some of the technicalities that we are working with. Does that all make sense? So let me start with the decision tree and see if that makes any sense at all. And then we'll go to some of the technical pieces, and I'll weave some of that in throughout. And then I want to allow plenty of space for some robust Q&A. And here's my commitment to you. I will not be able to answer every question you have. What I can do is collect them and get back to you via Elizabeth. Does that sound fair? Thank you very much. Okay, so let's walk through the decision tree. And thank you up there for telling me that you could not read this, so I'm going to read all of these boxes to you, okay? The first one, how to decide whether to stay or leave your annual conference. We need to start there because it's stay or leave the annual conference. That is important. Who passed the traditionalist plan? General Conference. That's important. As congregations, we are not actually members of the General Conference. Our membership is with the Annual Conference. Can I just share something that I learned through this process? As we started this work, we reached out to our conference chancellor, who is our legal counsel for the annual conference, to start getting our brains around, okay, what are we going to do here? And we asked about churches leaving the United Methodist Church as a result of this. And this is what I learned. Are you ready? You're all sitting down. This is a big one. It was for me. The United Methodist Church does not legally exist. You okay? Still with me? Does not legally exist. And I said, come on, what? So what was I ordained in? I mean, what is this? And here's what I learned from our conference chancellor. So we are an organization much like a Rotary Club, any Rotarians in the room, or Kiwanis or something like that, where we're associations of associations, essentially. So even though General Conference is our highest legislative body that is tasked with discerning church law, where it has to be carried out is at the annual conference level. Okay? And the annual conference is the highest legally constituted entity in the United Methodist Church. Worth the price of admission so far? Yeah. Excellent question. Thank you for that. So what is the annual conference? The annual conference boundaries for us are the state of Minnesota. That is for the state of Minnesota. We share a bishop with the Dakotas, but it's like a 2-point charge in United Methodist parlance. So it's like our bishop is a pastor with 2 churches that he serves. Does that make sense? Okay. So the highest legally constituted body is the annual conference. So what we have right now in Minnesota is this very strange situation where our general conference is moving that way, and at annual conference, our conference voted on a piece of legislation sponsored by the Minnesota Methodists, which laid out an inclusive vision of LGBT folks for the future of our annual conference, and that passed by 85%. So general conference is moving that way. Annual conference is moving this way. Now, the church law that is passed at general conference, it is supposed to be enforced at the annual conference level. So what we have as a situation is the folks actually tasked with carrying out church law from general conference have voted to move away from the direction of general conference. Do you see where we're at? Do you see where we're at? So this is important. You see why it's important that we have these spaces in these conversations. So the annual conference is now in the space where we're saying we stand in dissent with the decisions of General Conference 2019. So is that clear that General Conference is over there? Okay, good. Want to make sure. So where does that leave us on these questions of individual congregation affiliation and disaffiliation? Yep, here we go. All right. So how to decide to stay or leave your annual conference. Are we clear about why that's important now? Okay, very good. Okay, the first decision point. Does a majority of your congregation want to resist the 2019 General Conference decision to adopt the traditionalist plan? Now, that box under there, which absolutely none of you can read, that essentially says that each congregation needs to figure out itself. There is no shortcut here, right? Each congregation needs to sort itself out on where its values are. That's one reason why so many congregations are coming online through the reconciling process now, that congregations are sort of addressing this question in a way they have not before. Does that all make sense? I'm going to ask that lots, because that's what I do. My poor congregation, they say, yes, it makes sense. Stop it. I love my people. But anyhow, so each congregation needs to sort itself out. So congregations like Rochester Christ, who have already gone through a process of discerning where God is calling you in regards to these questions, you're already sort of on that level. Does that make sense? You've already sort of done that. Okay. So did your annual conference vote to reject the traditionalist plan? And what's the answer to that? Very good. So we have both the church, the local congregation, and the annual conference, the highest legally constituted body, have voted in the same direction. Clear? Are we all clear on that? Very good. All right, so that's a yes and a yes. Now, I'm going to go through the no and the no just so you can see where those congregations' decision trees will take them, but I'll do that very briefly. So, does a congregation want to resist the traditionalist plan? No. If the annual conference had voted to reject it, had voted not to reject it as well, then they could go all the way down to stay in the annual conference, no action required. Does that make sense? They'd be no, no, stay. Now, we have congregations in our annual conference who do not want to resist the traditionalist plan, but now find themselves at odds with the annual conference. You see that? And so now they have the conversation of leaving the annual conference through the disaffiliation amendment, which I'll get to in a minute. So that's their decision tree, right? Your decision tree, and I'm making assumptions here, throw something at me if I'm being too assumptive. You have the child's area behind you, Elizabeth, something that there would be really appropriate to throw at me. It's softer, right? There's some stuffed animal? Okay. All right, so the real question for Christ Church and for other congregations sort of in your same space is this. Are you willing to be part of the annual conference's transition after the traditionalist plan? That's the question that you really need to wrestle with is, do you want to join with the other churches in the annual conference in the what's next of the annual conference? Because the annual conference has said, we're not going that way. We're going that way. Does that make sense? Okay. If the answer is no, then you leave the annual conference through the current process in the Book of Discipline, which I'll speak to in a minute. If the answer is yes, then you stay in the annual conference as it transitions to the what's next. Does that all make sense? I'm going to pause. I have a question about if you're willing to be a part of your annual conference's transition. So if you say no, does that mean you're basically declaring your church as an independent or non-affiliated church with anyone? That is a great question, and we're getting there in just a second. So thank you. You're like the best audience plant ever because you're in the front row. All right. Any other questions? Because I'm going to take us into what these disaffiliation processes look like. Oh, thank you, sir. Oh, boy. Did you hear this, man? What's your name, sir? John. It is nice to meet you. Thank you for that question. So here... Yeah, I will repeat that. Thank you for that. The question was, so can the annual conference disaffiliate from the general conference? Oh, buddy. So, you need a little more coffee for this. Thank you, sir. Yeah. So this is actually the question. That is the question right now, because we are far from the only annual conference in this space. And in fact, the most recent comprehensive look at the United States, the United Methodist Church in the United States, I saw it was that 75% of annual conferences in the United States have voted to resist the traditionalist plan. 75%. Oh, that's such a great question, and I don't have it in my mind. Yeah, there's a map. And that was a story. Yeah. North and South Dakota, that's its own story. Yeah, go ahead, sir. That's exactly the question we're at, sir. Yeah. So let me go to this annual conference question because I think that might help answer this question. So the highest legally constituted body is the annual conference, right? So what that means is that functionally and legally speaking, and I'm speaking in layman's terms here, but this is coming from our conference chancellor. I wanted to get my ducks in a row before I got here. The annual conference is the United Methodist Church. So the annual conference can't disaffiliate because it's like a chair deciding to leave itself. It can't do that. It's the thing. So now, that said, there are folks who are working on legislation for General Conference 2020, which would create a pathway. But currently, there is not a pathway in the Book of Discipline for an annual conference to leave this association of associations that we call the United Methodist Church. Yes, sir. Yeah, so each annual conference, so the annual conferences, many of them are voting on these resistance resolutions, and some of them are really strong. I would put Minnesota's legislation in the very strong bucket. Some of them were more we lament the harm done sort of thing, which isn't, please don't hear that I don't lament the harm done, but that's very different than we're moving in this direction. Does that make sense? So part of it depends on the tone and the tenor of the resistance resolutions that came forward in each annual conference. So different annual conferences are approaching this really differently. The Western jurisdiction is having a very different conversation than we are here in North Central. So it's a complex space, but what I want you to hear from me is that currently there is not a path for the annual conference to disaffiliate. Now, there are lots of more creative legal minds and people who know church law in ways that I hope to never have to know, who are working on other pathways. For example, becoming a missionary annual conference. Or a missionary conference. That's one path. Another is, could we form a super jurisdiction of annual conferences that have elected to reject this plan? So those are various paths, but all paths currently go through general conference action. So redrawing jurisdictional lines, that happens at general conference. Forming a new missionary conference happens at general conference. Does that make sense? Missionary conference. Well, thank you, Ted. Missionary conference. We have. I'll give you an example. We have one in Oklahoma. It's a Native American missionary annual conference. So it's separate from the region around it, and it's for a specific group of people. Does that make sense? So, for example, Rio Grande annual conference is also fit in that bucket. It is geographically contiguous, at least in part, with another annual conference. But it's a ministry for and with a very specific group, usually a language or a cultural ministry. So there are people who are investigating whether that would work for churches who are, and for annual conferences who are moving in this direction. Yeah. There's no path to leave the general conference because it's not, but it's not a legal entity. It's not a thing. So why does there need to be? I don't understand. And that's fair. That's fair. Most of it is because of our public witness. So the question was, why do we need to leave the general conference if, in fact, we're the highest legally constituted? Yeah. And there are some who are asking a question of, do we have to do anything? So that question is pertinent to Christchurch. Give me a second here, Bruce, okay? That question is pertinent to Christchurch in that, are you willing as a congregation to work with other congregations in the annual conference moving in this direction? Because there's a lot to be figured out if that's the case. But we also live in connection, and I'll get to that in a minute, and that might be the right path. That's for you to discern and decide. That's not for me to tell you. So the pertinence of all of these sort of, can an annual conference leave itself, or should it even bother to leave the general conference? Those are only relevant if this congregation feels called to be part of the movement in Minnesota to the new thing. Is that clear? Is that clear? Okay. Yes, sir.
For our affiliation with places like summer camps, the universities, Encore, all of the other groups.
Yeah, and that is one reason why nobody's moving quickly on this. So his question was, what would be the consequences of summer camps, our shared ministries, disaster relief? I'm adding some, but I just want to make sure that if the congregation decided to disaffiliate. And that is actually the issue and why we're trying to make it slow and go well, because the bishop's language has been go strong, go together, because a lot of these things might fall apart if we decided tomorrow, that, hey, I'm out of this and don't want any part of where it's moving. That's absolutely the case. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But our conference making a decision, I think is relevant part of my question.
Absolutely. And so even if not just the congregation leaving, but what would happen if the whole annual conference moved away? And that is another reason why we're moving slow. Core, who wants to give up on the good work they're doing, right? A lot of, I think of Operation Classroom in Sierra Leone, all of these things that we have done in connection, across the connection, and we're a connectional church. We've always believed that we can do more together. So that the consequences would be very real and very dire if churches decided to disaffiliate tomorrow. That's exactly true. Yes, sir. Pension's also an issue, yeah. So Westpath, which is our new denominational pension body, kind of a strange name, Westpath. But anyhow, they actually set themselves up. I think they saw something none of the rest of us did. They set themselves up the way they articulate it to, quote unquote, serve the whole church, whatever ends up emerging. So I am not on board of pensions and health. If that's a question that this congregation has more of, I would refer that to Kathy Schill, who is our chair of Board of Pensions and Health. And it is I will just say this much. It is a very complex space. Talking about health insurance and pensions. And there's lots and lots of layers to that question. So that's one reason why I don't want to speak too much to it. Ted.
Explain to us the different kind of votes between when the United States versus the General Conference and
Okay, so what Ted has asked me to do is do some explanation for how we are a global church and how that impacts where we find ourselves today. Some of you may be aware of that, but in case that needs to be sort of solidified and clarified, I will speak to that. Thank you, Ted. So we are a global church in ways that most other global denominations are not, in that we have actual structural obligations to one another. Looking at our friends, for example, in the Episcopalian or Anglican communion, theirs is a much more loosely connected body. And so they don't have necessarily the same denominational structural obligations to each other that we have created over the years. So, as a global church, our biggest area of growth has been in Southeast Asia and in Africa. Those have been the places of the biggest growth. And the conversation around human sexuality in that part of the world is very different for many people. And so, as those conferences have grown, and as the United States, I don't think I need to reiterate here where we've seen the main line in numbers, even though at this church and other churches, we're seeing some wonderful growth and wonderful good things. That's not true everywhere. So, as a consequence, the global church has a vote. The global church voted on this, and whereas that has implications for us that it wouldn't have if, say, we were Presbyterian or if we were Episcopalian or even Lutheran, because those tend to be regional bodies that affiliate on sort of a sacramental level, but not on a structural level. Does that make sense? Okay. So anyhow, we have these obligations to each other. And, one thing I just want to lift up is that the global church is taking kind of a beating in this conversation. And I think we need to be humble and kind about the different realities Christians face in different parts of the world. I'm not thrilled we are where we are as a global church, but sometimes the language we end up using for our brothers and sisters in the African annual conferences has not been humble or kind over the past few months. So I just want to name that. We're a conference that has lots of folks from all parts of the world, and we bless that. And if we can model a new way forward here, then that gives me a lot of hope for, a global church. But let's just name that and put that in the room, okay? All right. Ted, did that answer your question? Thank you.
Well, in Africa, it's only in the last 50 or 60 years where they can even whisper the word homosexuality, because in their culture, it's an absolute anathema.
Yeah, the conversation is very, very different. And we need to name that, even as we name that we have our own path that God has called us toward. So, okay. Anything else on that? Okay, because now what I'd like to do is to get into the nuts and bolts of the disaffiliation process so you can get a feel for it. Not to say that this is the path necessarily that you would want to choose, but to say that I want to make sure you have the best information possible as you are discerning how God is calling this congregation forward. So, disaffiliation. Oh boy. So, how many of you know that there is already a pathway in the Book of Discipline for churches that want to disaffiliate? Now you should all raise your hands because I just told you, but yeah. So that is true. That said, there was the graceful amendment, and you'll see why I'm putting air quotes, big, heavy air quotes around this in a minute, was passed alongside the traditionalist legislation at General Conference. So this has been a huge learning process for me because since I have been chair of trustees, we haven't had churches wanting to disaffiliate until we got to this moment in our annual conference. We just haven't, that hasn't been a very present conversation. Now, certainly there have been congregations upset about this or that. That's always true. And I know you've never been upset about anything in your lives, Rochester Christ Church. But just take that empathetic leap with me that there are some that sometimes are. Okay? Okay, good. So, here's what I have learned about the disaffiliation processes and how they compare. The disaffiliation amendment, as it was passed at General Conference, is around a very narrow question. Do you disagree on the matter of human sexuality as a congregation? That is the question. You cannot disaffiliate under this amendment for any other reason. So if you're cranky with how money in apportionments is being used, you wanted it to build yourself a swimming pool, whatever, can't use it. It is around this very narrow question. Now, What's the problem with framing the whole process based on the congregation's answer to this one question? How can you assess that? How can you assess that? You really can't. So already we're starting at sort of a step back, in my opinion. We can't, only God can search minds and hearts, right? We have no idea if that's how this will be used or not. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that a church can leave keeping its property. That's the part that most people are aware of, that the Graceful Amendment did allow for churches to keep their property. That comes with some really big howevers, okay? Really big howevers. The first big however is you owe 12 months prior and 12 months forward on apportionments, 12 months prior, 12 months forward on pension and health benefits. That's where the calculations are being done right now. So I won't speak to where Rochester Christ is at because I do not have those figures and would not do that, and I don't want to lead anyone astray. But that gives you sort of a rough starting point. So that's a lot of money, right? It's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And here's the last piece that I think is most important. It is only applicable during this window of time, January 1, 2020 to December 31, 2023. Did you catch that? So there's a window that you can use this amendment to disaffiliate. And that's intentional, in part because there is another general conference coming up in 2020. And so I'm going to speak personally here. I don't believe anybody who says they know what's going to happen at general conference. Like, I just don't. Because, we don't really know. And I think our bishop actually says it best. He says what we learned at 2019 is that our structures are inadequate to govern us, a body this diverse. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that. So anyhow, those are sort of the outlines of the disaffiliation amendment process. Now, there is a process already in the Book of Discipline. What it looks like in broad terms is a negotiated agreement with the annual conference by means of the district superintendent, some way of dealing with the trust clause, and we have released the trust clause before, nothing new under the sun, we could do it again. That's the annual conference's decision. I will be honest, as board chair of trustees, we do not want church buildings on our books. Thank you, don't need that. But the outlines of the process that's in the Book of Discipline are actually much broader. And it's a negotiated agreement rather than these very prescribed things we find in the disaffiliation amendment. Does that make sense? So now we have question marks about, okay, so January 1, 2020, can we still use that process if we want to? And jury is out on that. Or are all things put into this disaffiliation amendment bucket? Jury's still out on that. So there's some question marks there, but I want you to be aware that there is already a process and that there is this disaffiliation amendment process. And we are trying to sort that out at the annual conference task force level to do what's right by the churches who feel called to move in this direction ultimately. I want to open up questions for that, mostly because I want to collect them because I probably won't be able to answer them at this point. Yes, ma'am. What about the churches that don't want to disaffiliate? Then that part of the conversation you don't have to have. No. It would have to be a congregation making that choice. Yeah. The annual conference is not in the business of saying, not you, not you, not you, you, not you. They're not in that business. So it would be on the congregation to discern its own values. Yes, Elizabeth. That's tomfoolery. I know. So I'll refer back to that. Legally speaking. So church law does not offer a way for an annual conference to disaffiliate. It does not offer that. Now, does that mean that there might be a legal remedy in the secular court system? That's its own conversation. I'm talking about church law specifically. Yep. So, but currently there is not a path for an annual conference to leave. Yes, ma'am.
Let's say there's so many annual conferences in the U.S. that are feeling the need to resist. Could they not develop their own some core different kinds of mission group things, you know, to support. I know it's not on a worldly basis, but
Well, there's nothing stopping that. I think the conversation is what to do with what already exists in those mission spaces. So nothing stopping whatever mission or ministry lies ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a complicated question I have about this whole thing. We talk about LGBTQIA when we talk about these issues, but this particular, the traditionalist plan specifically addresses homosexuality. Is it homosexuality only? What about like if I'm transgender,
Right.
and I've transitioned to male, can I become a minister? I mean, and if I'm not gay, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, totally. And
I have transgender members.
absolutely, yeah.
I'm like, so once you transition, like if you're transgender male and you transition to male, if you are attracted to females,
Mm-hmm.
is that somehow okay because you're not gay? Or I mean, that's.
No, I think that's
I'm wondering how much all of this complicates this, because we talk a lot about LGBTQIA.
But what about the trans and gender identity?
The T or the intersex.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're just, and I'm confused about what this means for that too.
I think that's a really fair question. Did you all hear this question about, so we talk about the whole spectrum, but really a lot of these issues seem centered in those first two letters of L and G, and LG and B, I would say. Yeah. And here's what I would say. This is outside my space because that's Board of Ordained Ministry territory, and I want to name that. I'm property. I deal with this stuff, right? Like human beings scare me and frighten me.
We participate in ASP. We have participated in the church that we moved from has participated almost as long in ASP, and they still refer to the boys' sleeping space and the girls' sleeping space, and we try not to do that, but that's the way it's set up. So like, how does it affect things like that? I'm just curious.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think one thing we need to name is that the thinking behind the traditionalist plan didn't necessarily carry intersectional sophistication as regards these categories.
So it had nothing to do with gender.
It really,
It's all about
yeah. So that would be my argument and my understanding. Now, Board of Ordained Ministry might have something different to say. What I think is important to hear in this space is that the work that especially reconciling congregations and longstanding reconciling congregations have done around naming gender identity, number one, is separate from human sexual orientation. I mean, that's a leap that folks in the United States, many haven't made yet. Right. And so that you put that across a global connection, and you're already 3 and 4 steps removed from where the conversation is at in so many places. So I think we need to be aware that the conversation is in different places in different parts of the world, and the places where a lot of the support for the traditionalist plan came from were not necessarily places that have had a lot of conversation about difference between cisgender and transgender and so on and so forth. It's a different set of vocabulary that's used altogether. And that's one of the big tensions and challenges of being the global body that we've tried to be, is you have churches that have already had several conversations about this and are talking about things very, very differently, and talking about gender with which we identify and so on and so forth. And then places where that's language is completely alien and foreign. And so, and you see that tension reflected in our Book of Discipline. You really do. Yeah. Uh-huh.
I believe it was in the late 80s when the California Supreme Court held the trust provision was revocable, and therefore the church could change its trust provision for has that been changed in other states to correct?
So this is a question about the trust clause and its nature, correct? Okay, I want to make sure, yeah. So broadly speaking, here's what I can say, is that the trust clause in the United Methodist Church, more so than trust clauses in many other denominations, has held up over the years and over the generations. Historically speaking, the majority, not all, but the majority of cases, the courts have found in favor of the denomination whenever the trust clause has been challenged. So, say again. That would be, for the most part, although the Supreme Court certainly had things to say about it, and it has been upheld at that level. Yes, sir.
There was a case in New England of a community church that wanted to get out of the denomination, and the courts sided with them because they said, because the district superintendent has never visited that church in 6 years, the church did not maintain the connection. So a key element in the trust clause is that we are a connectional church and we need to maintain that relationship.
Yeah, I think, yes. I'll just say yes to that, Ted. So anyhow, broadly speaking, legally the trust clause has held up, and therefore we don't get to disregard it as part of these conversations and say, oh, what, we can just get past that. There are no guarantees on that. In fact, the weight of legal decisions has been on upholding the trust clause. But that's not to say that if the denomination has not held up its obligations in some form or fashion, that there aren't significant questions. It's sort of like, what's that law? Law of adverse possession. Do I have any attorneys in the house? Oh, you are one. Okay, there we go. The law of adverse possession. We just went through this as a congregation where we had a strip of our back triangle behind our property. And, you know where I'm at. And this strip of property, and a local homeowner believed that he had rights to it, and we had to go back and demonstrate that we had been caring for the property. And finding documents on how often you mow is really difficult. So, exactly. And so that's where you could make an argument that's state by state. But anyhow, largely speaking, trust clause held up. We have to deal with that as part of this conversation. That's what I want to make sure is here. Yeah.
It seems to me that the United Methodist Church has gone through slavery, women's rights. Now we're talking about sexual rights. When is the church ever going to have the conversation that we're not going to identify groups?
So the question was, we've been through all these, we've been through these divisions before. How long is it going to take us to learn? And that's an excellent question. Yeah. So, yeah. I hear that frustration, and I want to honor it because it is deeply painful to watch this playing out on the global stage. So. Yeah. Yeah, and that is a painful conversation because the folks who wouldn't necessarily be in the same place as Rochester Christ would argue that they're not the ones taking the step away, but it's the folks who are moving in the inclusive direction that are. So it's a conflicted space because we're telling such different stories about what the church is and should be. Yeah. So there's yay, how are you?
What's our commitment as an annual conference to the general conference, which involves then disaffiliation, since there is not that possibility. And what is the obligation of the general conference to the annual conference?
Yeah.
So if we have no legal commitment to the general conference, but we have a moral or ecclesiastical commitment, structural, where does that fall in?
Are you talking commitment in terms of funds and financial support? Yeah. Yeah.
But if all we have to do is the annual conference and say we disaffiliate ourselves, we are not going to be part of that group anymore, unless there's some kind of legal responsibility.
Yeah.
What is that obligation?
So the legal obligation of the annual conference to the general conference, yeah. So the annual conference is constituted by action of the general conference. So each annual conference is formed based on the action of general conference. Now, there's argument to be made that there are limits to what that is, and a lot of conferences are testing the limits of that. Now, here's what I want to lift up one of the ugly things where this has gone. So, are you familiar? Have you heard the language of the Wesleyan Covenant Association? Is that language is familiar to you? So, if you're nodding heads, Wesleyan Covenant Association, you could think of it as the opposite number of the Reconciling Network on the other side of the aisle. Many of them have, it was in the news recently, they have committed to stop paying apportionments to the general church. That's part of this question. Yeah, you see what I'm saying? So this is a much more complex question than just stay or go. It's implications for all these other bodies. That's what it means to be a connectional church, and why we have to discern carefully and discern well and prayerfully where it is we're called to go. Because when we see that begs a question, doesn't it? And so we need to be very mindful of how we proceed. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question. It probably didn't. So in terms of legal obligation, we are constituted by church law. And that is an open question right now that some better legal minds than I are trying to figure out, because there are annual conferences ready to just walk away, whole jurisdictions ready to just walk away. Sorry about that. Except for the annual conference. It says the legally constituted body. Now, that's different from church law. That's different from church law. Yeah, and how far do we want to go down the road of leaning on secular law to decide internal disputes? That's not an insignificant piece of this conversation.
So who really holds the properties? Who really holds the money?
UMCOR is its own organized, it is its own 501c3. Yeah, so a lot of our boards and agencies are their own set up 501c3s, and many camps are. Ours are not yet. They're exploring what their options are. So the board's agencies, those have set up as their own thing so they can receive, process donations and things like that. So hope that answers that question. Where else are we at? What other questions? Yeah, Bruce.
There are two things that I think you've not talked about that complicate the situation. One is it's unimaginable to know the rules of General Conference unless you've been there. And even then, most of the questions are not about debate. They're about points of order. Specific paragraphs in the Constitution which seem to violate what they're talking about. And so it's impossible for most people to understand that situation when General Conference convenes, because they have their own way. For instance, bishops cannot talk unless they're asked to do so by the conference. Yeah. We don't do anything that way any other place. The second concern is that, as I remember, and it may have changed since I was in your shoes, the property is tied to confession of faith. In 68, when we came together, there are 3 confessions of faith. They're still in discipline. Because if we had written a new one, anybody who said, but I'm one of the old confessions, got the property. Mm-hmm. Now, that's oversimplification, but it's still one of the complicating factors of disaffiliation. Yeah. How do you, well, the annual conference this year had an issue in which we wrote a confession of faith.
Well, somebody proposed putting a general, it was not, no, and it was not approved. It was tabled indefinitely, Bruce. So, yeah, so that was ultimately not adopted by the annual conference. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Oh boy. Yeah. So, broadly speaking, what we have is we've created this in the United States. Can we just say that this is a lot of chickens coming home to roost for what we've done in the United States? And you'll see what I mean here in a minute. What we have is a separation between what we refer to as the annual conferences and the central conferences. Annual conferences are the highest legally constituted body of the United Methodist Church, right? Central conferences organized by the General Conference for specific areas with the understanding that they'll be supported by the annual conferences, but they're able to adopt their own versions of the Book of Discipline, and they're able to do that by discipline. So we have a situation where we have folks coming from conferences that can vote on what we do here as a denomination in Minnesota as an annual conference. But the annual conference can't put the same binding things on where they are over there. So we created this. We created this U.S.-centric picture, And now it's come back to bite us. I'm just going to say that very frankly with you all. This was, the worst of our colonial impulses have come back to haunt us. So we said that the annual conferences, those are the United States. That's us, and then there was the them out there in central conferences who, they should have their own ability to navigate and negotiate how they want to do things. And by creating that system, what did we do? That's where we are. So, yes, sir.
It's more and more complicated, especially on the discrimination issue. UMCOR is a separate body. What if UMCOR wants to give money to a country where they really discriminate against gays? Would that be something we are?
And I think I won't speak for UMCOR. I think that would be a great thing to suss out, and even worth emailing the director or a director there. I think broadly speaking, UMCOR would say no country we serve is perfect, and so that every place we respond to a disaster, there's disasters and there's people hurting and wounded. And if we just absent ourselves from places where policies are terrible, well, in the U.S. we have some things we're not so proud of right now either. So that's what I think the response would be. Have I complicated things for you? Okay, good. I've got two here. I want to go to her first since she has something. Yeah.
Are they going to drop open parts like rules of the minds? It's like they never leave my fingernail when I hear that.
No, I get it. I get it. Yeah. Yeah, what I would, if you're interested in hearing more about where that is right now, I would encourage you to reach out to the United Methodist Communications Agency, because that's the genesis of and holder of that. Good. Okay, so you're way ahead of me on that, and that's what I would say. Yeah. John?
Because we have to settle what the annual conference can or cannot disaffiliate or what have you. And I'm going to guess our congregations are going to want to leave on the conservative side because they don't like what our annual conference is doing. They're going to be churches. On the progressive side, you are going to be unhappy with the rate of progress that's being made by the annual conference to do whatever. So I think it's good for all of us, no matter what side of the fence we are on.
To hear that.
To hear exactly, hey, this is what the rules of the game are.
Sure. Okay, so what we've had is, regardless of where a church finds itself on, where a church finds itself, let's just say that, how would the disaffiliation pan out? Is that accurate? Okay, so I'll just walk through that. And this, I want to say, is very preliminary. If you quote me outside these doors, we never talked. You're horrible, Elizabeth. This is where it stands now. And there will be, I think that the intent, January 1 is our deadline for when this process will be finalized. And that will be a checklist that congregations can make use of. So it begins with the congregation discerning its own space and where it is. It needs a vote of 2/3 to make this choice to disaffiliate. That said, there is a lengthy, what we call exploration process that we're trying to map out for folks to figure out the whys and wherefores, the financials, obligations. Is a church indebted? What are the mission impacts of a church in an area if they walk away? There's many, many questions that would go into what we refer to as an exploration conversation. Then if through the process of exploration, they would decide to move forward, that'd be a letter to the district superintendent. And then there would be still some sort of negotiated agreement on, yes, I understand that apportionments are X. Yes, I understand that pensions are X. Yes, I understand that property comes with us. I understand that these implications are this for us and not for them, and so on and so forth. And then it goes up for a Board of Trustees vote once that whole process is completed to ultimately ratify what the church wants to do. And then the annual conference, because this is one provision that some folks balked at, the annual conference ultimately has to ratify the whole end of process. So it begins with an exploratory process where a church really dives into itself on its own values, its own assets, its own mission impact. And then it leads to charge conference decision, which leads to a negotiated agreement, which would lead to annual conference ratifying it. Really broad strokes, but that's what I feel comfortable saying right now. Does that answer your question, John? The lights are horrible, so I can't see your expression. I'm so sorry.
Well, in a way, basically what you're saying is that whatever a congregation wants to do or not to do, the annual conference votes on it and says, you're full of it, we aren't going to go with what you want to do.
Right.
You know that.
The church's board of trustees can come up with a decision after all of this, and then the board of trustees for the annual conference can still say, no, we won't let you be part of the annual.
Yeah, this was part of, again, this is part of the disaffiliation amendment. I'm not here to defend or to make you like it, because I'm not, perhaps you have picked up on my own feelings toward it. I don't know if I'm being transparent enough. But yes, they could not get around a book of discipline clause whereby a church's exit or entry into the denomination has to be by action of the annual conference.
But not the general conference, because it doesn't.
No, yeah, it's from the annual conference. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah, and again, I would leave that to your prayerful discernment about how this congregation needs to proceed. And I would refer you to your pastor, Elizabeth. But in truth, there are several strategies, maybe that's the best way to say it, that are being explored by folks who feel like perhaps the means is there for annual conferences to move in a different direction. And so some very creative possibilities, just like the one you name, are being sussed out for whether they pass muster with the discipline. But it's with a whole range of options that are being explored right now. I don't know if that answers that question or not. Yeah. Again, yeah, I don't know that I can speak to that. But then the question becomes, if you leave the annual conference, which some churches will, and if that's what you're called to do, that's what you're called to do. There is now also a movement within the annual conference to transform the denomination, and 75% of other annual conferences too. So if you feel called to be an independent congregation, that's one thing. But if you're called to be part of the movement on other things, that's another thing. So that's where the conversation really needs to happen at a church level. Yeah.
I think the urge to leave is strong, but there's a lot of stuff that will go away if we do that. 12 of the 13 seminaries are not conservative. There's this whole pension fund. There's a lot of stuff that's at stake here. And I think it makes more sense to stick it out. We have a bishop who supports what we believe and give it some more time. Because basically, as I see it, the General Conference and then the Judicial Council, we're trying to say, you guys get out of here and don't let the door hit you in the rear on the way out. And we're pushing back and saying, no, wait a minute. That's not right. This needs to be done in a way that's proper, not quick. That's what they want. They want us to leave right now with nothing. That's not what we should be doing.
What I'm taking away from what I've heard so far on the financial end of this is that we aren't going to know until the 1st of January what it would cost us financially. I'm on the leadership board, treasurer, okay? So we aren't going to know what it's going to cost financially until then. So it doesn't make sense to me that we make any rash decisions, at least until the 1st of January of next year, and maybe not until after the general conference.
Yeah.
Then we have 4 years to make that decision after.
I think that's a really good rough cut. I think that is. Because what you can't do right now is go to your district superintendent and say, hey, what would it cost us? You can't do that. Those numbers don't exist yet. Yeah, no. We share a district superintendent. I know.
Although we need to be careful that finances do not become defining our values.
Yep.
My experience has been is when money comes into play, values go out the window very quickly.
Sure.
I'm not suggesting that we should do that.
I'm just saying we need
Yeah. Yeah. So what I would, so here's my parting shot for you all, because I see Elizabeth ready to get the candy cane out and pull me off the floor. Is that number one, know that as the board chair, I am praying with and for you as you walk this journey, and as part of Northfield Church, which is part of the connection in many ways with you all. We are already walking some of these questions and decisions and discernments together. And what I would love to hear from you in the coming days is any questions you feel like weren't answered, or that you didn't necessarily have at the tip of your tongue today. Because sometimes if you're like me, it takes time to process, and you don't even know what your question is until 5 days later, and then the speaker's gone. But you know where I live, literally. I'm right next door to Northfield United Methodist Church. So if you have something that I did poorly, or that you need to hear more about as a congregation, I will do my best. But I do want you to know that some of the things that you would need for these discernment pieces don't exist yet, per se. But I would encourage you to continue to be prayerful, to continue to be discerning, to continue to be wise. And any way that I can help support you in that discernment process, I am here. And if that is up to and including leaving you alone as you make those choices. So that is,
At what point do you think we will have options to look at as far as affiliation? For example, that might be coming from our annual conference, which I would guess would be a year from now.
Mm-hmm.
But that's going to be in South Dakota, so it may or may not be something that is going to help us. I know that there are meetings of other conferences and other organizations within the body
Mm-hmm.
that are, struggling with this. When do you think there may be some point where we can even say it's worth looking at?
Oh, wow, I hesitate to put a date on that. Question was, when might we have some sense of, yeah. It'll be January 2nd. Yeah. January 2nd, yeah. I think that's a worthy question. And so what I would encourage you to do is, your pastor Elizabeth has been engaged in some of these conversations that have happened around the annual conference. So she has a deep awareness, deeper than many, of what some of those are. And if you are interested in that next level sort of thing, not just what's happening here at Rochester Christ, but for the annual conference, I would really encourage you to participate in that. And by doing that, you will be better able to answer that than me, because those things are happening sort of away from the ball. I feel like my charge from my positional space as board chair is to help create the infrastructure so that when the right thing comes to us, then we're able to move as swiftly as reason can warrant in the direction to which we are called. Is that vague enough to cover all these things? Good.
It's so vague and so beautiful.
Yeah.
So I just want to say just a quick thing. First, thank you very much for being here. Don't turn that mic off yet. And the other thing I want to let you know is that next Sunday, following the 9 o'clock service, we'll have a time of being able to talk about process. How will we learn these things? How will we come to know these things? How will we talk amongst ourselves? How will we take deep breaths and trust that God is in the middle of all of this? So we will go strong and we will go together. That is the commitment that the Leadership Board is making to this congregation because it's the best way to go. So I'd like to thank you for being here. The session from last Sunday is on our website if you want to watch the information from last Sunday. And then next Sunday we'll be together at 10 after 10 in the sanctuary. And I asked Rachel to keep her microphone on. Maybe you'd pray for us. Will you do that?
Can do that.
Thanks.
All right, friends, let us pray. We find ourselves coming out of Egypt, O God. We pray for the patience of Sinai, that we could sit at the foot of the mountain and see what law descends. We know the promised land is well out ahead of us at this point, O God. Get us to Sinai. I pray for this church, for the leaders here, for the folks who have been so deeply wounded. Even as we give thanks for this movement we are seeing across the connection to embrace an inclusive vision for what you are about and have always been about. We pray your presence in every conversation in this place and others where these decisions are being considered. And we pray that it would be your wisdom in our ears, in our mouths, that we would have the words we need when we need them most, the silences we need when we need to hear. Make us ready, O God. Our hands are yours. Amen.
Amen.